Greetings, greetings. I am coming to you just an hour or so before our winter solstice. And I thought that I would drop in around some of the solstice imagery and symbolism, just because it's a practice that we've been doing the last couple of months with Sky Dancer, just really looking at what the symbolic significations are for the moment that we're moving through, because there is so much chaos in the collective. And I think it's always really helpful at these key astrological moments to ground ourselves in what the evolutionary energy is. And the solstice certainly is a key evolutionary moment. I really love the winter solstice. I always have. It's so integral and tied into the symbolism of the solstice is very tied into the work that we do in Sky Dancer with the Venus cycle, in that we are traveling on the descent side of Venus's cycle into the underworld, and then we'll go on the ascent. And that's very similar. Most cycles have a similar rhythm to it. It's very similar to the the sun's pattern in the sky, whereas the sun was just on its descent journey. Um, and it will now kind of hibernate for the next 3 days, kind of like that underworld symbolism that we find in the resurrection story and we find in Anana's story. And then it will rise on December 25th, like the birth of the sun, the immaculate birth. And then it will go on its ascent journey for the next half of the year. What's really fun in the feminine is to we're always playing with paradox, and any kind of like astrology is a feminine language. Anytime we're dropping in with symbolism, we're in the realm of the feminine, the non-linear, the non-rational. And so it's fun to look at, even though the sun will be technically from December 25th until the summer solstice on its ascent journey, between now and the spring equinox, we're still in the dark half of the year, meaning that there is more night time than there is daytime. So, given that the nights are still long, what does it mean for the sun to be on its ascent journey, but still in the dark half of the year? And in the feminine, we're always weaving with these sort of seeming paradoxes. And, one of the things we could dip in with is sort of this idea of, beginning to break out of the chrysalis, right? Like right now in this still of winter, these 3 days, we're germinating in those imaginal cells. And then once the sun begins its ascent journey, we're kind of muscling with the chrysalis a little bit, or that symbolism that you get around, a seed that's been planted, which is always in the dark, that has burst open. And we get this imagery around Imbolc every year, which is the cross quarter holiday, or the midpoint holiday between solstice and equinox. And that's where you get that idea of like the seed breaking open, but it's still in the dark, like it hasn't crested through the top of the soil to meet the air yet. So that's where we get some of these imageries, and we can kind of play with what is that in our own lives. What does it mean for us to and maybe we'll feel an energy shift. Like, just check in with yourself, check in with your body. Does it feel like they call this time of stillness right before mother night? Like, this is the dark mother's night, right? Where if we looked at the story of Anana, where Ereshkigal is in labor, or Mary potentially would have been in labor with Jesus. And so there's this stillness that happens before the birth of the sun on December 25th. And do you feel that kind of sense of being held, or that sense that there's stillness, things aren't moving? And then checking in again once we move through the holiday portal, to see if there is a sense of, just a small crack of light peeping in, or a sense of uplifting or momentum that tends to come in. So it's really fun to play with the astrology of the path of the sun, and how um, the sun has its own cycle like this. And I love these days. They're really important. Our solstice points and equinox points are the angles. They are the cardinal cross, which creates the quote unquote world tree. It's the north, south, east, and west of how we are sort of pinned into the solar system. So there are these really important thresholds that we move through on the wheel of the year. And for me, living in the northern hemisphere and kind of up north, I get to have all four seasons. And I feel like in a lot of ways, I'd be lost without them. There's this definite rhythm that my body follows with the seasons and the changing path of the sun. It's almost as if we're completely in sync. So I thought what we would do, because we have had just a really, I feel like I've said this every year around solstice. We've been in a really kind of destructive, meaning like deconstructing period every single solstice since 2020. I just keep saying it, we had at the solstice in, was it 2020? My dates get messed up. We had that Jupiter Saturn conjunction. They're going to move into a square this year. So it's like we've already moved so far past that. And then we had the Omicron variant the year after that on solstice. My whole family got sick. And then the year after that, I was launching Skydancer because we were in an underworld period at the solstice last year. The Venus was also in the underworld. And so I did like an event where I did some forecasting for the year ahead. And I'm not going to do that this year. I think this year, what's been so important to me and so present inside of Skydancer, because honestly, it's like whatever's alive in my life becomes the curriculum that I end up teaching, along with there's kind of a structural curriculum, but a lot of the teachings will mirror what's happening in my own life. And I had this really interesting experience at the summer solstice. For those of you who don't know, my son passed away in 2022. And so right around the solstice is when that anniversary of his death is. And I had this really interesting experience of feeling my body kind of be ready to build and do things again. And my heart really wanting to stay inside this really kind of cozy cave. And so there's been this kind of like internal, there's two parts that are moving at different speeds. And so I've been very aware of not wanting to move faster than the slowest part of myself. And then in September, right after we launched Skydancer, my husband went to visit his family overseas. And then the war broke out in Israel and Palestine. And obviously we have family in the West Bank. And yeah, it's just been this very interesting time of very heavy energies. But the one gift that it's given me is just how present I've been and how much I've been bringing myself back and grounding myself in the actual evolutionary energies, not planning, not running out in front of myself, just really, there's been a deep need to tend myself. And so doing these practices with really looking at what is the energy saying now? What are the themes of the sun's path? Because the sun has been so active in all of the events this fall. Like the war broke out during an eclipse. The sun is active during an eclipse, so as the sun has been moving, and then we had a sun-Mars conjunction. Obviously, the sun is involved in that. And things are evolving in that case with the war with that conjunction. So it's been really cool to drop in really deeply with the background energy of each sign and the tarot card. And I have been, you can watch previous transmissions, working with new or full moons, which of course always involve the sun. Um, and Lee McCloskey's book called Tarot Revisited. And so let me just show you the chart really quick. So solstices and equinoxes, like I said, they always happen at that 0 point of the cardinal signs. And so the sun will at 10:29 p.m., I think it's actually 10:27, will move into one of my computer programs says 10:27. This computer program here says 10:29, but that'll be the exact moment of the solstice. And the sun will move into Capricorn, conjunct Mercury in retrograde. And so we'll have a lot of Capricornian energy, not just like floating around in the background, but heady up here as well, because the sun will be conjunct Mercury. And Mercury is what they call Cazimi, so seeding his new cycle right now, along with the sun seeding his new cycle. So that's very symbolically relevant. So I thought that I'd start by showing you Lee's, Lee doesn't make tarot cards, but he does the illustration. So you can sort of see in the illustration that there's that like the egg with the snake wrapped around it. We've got our horned character that's sort of like Beelzebub, or I'm not sure what this guy's name is beyond that. I know there's lots of different names for him, and he's kind of sitting on his throne. And the tarot card for Capricorn is interestingly the devil. Now, Capricorn is ruled by the planet Saturn, and Saturn rules traditionally two different signs. He rules Capricorn and Aquarius. And they're both really important to understand the other one, like so that you can compare and contrast them to really get what they each mean. Capricorn, being the earth sign, is the feminine Saturn ruled sign, zodiacal sign. And so what the archetypes that could go along with Capricorn are like the hag or the wise woman, the crone, the circle of grandmothers. One of my old astrology teachers called it the boneyard. And you can see that that's because Saturn has this relationship to death, you know, like that character of death, the guy who rules time, limitation. He's got the scythe. He was forever, he was like the last planet, that visible planet that you could see with the naked eye. And so the ancients thought, you know, he was that ruler of thresholds, that space between worlds. It's got a little bit of a Scorpio flavor. It's interesting, there's some resonances between Capricorn and Scorpio, and I'm a Capricorn rule ruled person. Like my ascendant is in Capricorn and my sun is in Scorpio. And so there's these like real deep, dark themes in my life. So let's explore a little bit about what Lee has to say about the devil card and how that has something to do with where we're at in the world. So he says that this is the 15th key in the tarot arcana, and that's like in that Kabbalistic system, a deep hermetic system, that deep ancient wisdom, and is ruled by the cardinal sign of Capricorn, obviously. And Capricorn is ruled by Saturn, which is associated, like we said, with limitation, restriction, earthly power, and matter. The Greeks personified Saturn as Kronos, who served his father from his mother, or heaven from earth, and in so doing, he fashioned time. Time itself implies cycles and periods of space and duration, which create an illusion of separateness, allowing for manifestation. Like we need the tension of separation for manifestation. You can't manifest inside of inside of unity. There's no differentiation there. And this speaks to us about cycles, and the solstice, of course, is the beginning of a new cycle. In pre-Christian times, the half man, half goat, that's what this guy is. This Beelzebub guy is a goat. I couldn't find the word. Persona of the devil was originally that of Pan, who is an archetype. Pan was an earthly deity who celebrated and reveled in the sensual delights of earth. He played an important role as caretaker of the earth. And one of the things we haven't presenced on this call, but a lot of you may know about, is that this time of year is often called Saturnalia for the Roman people. So the pagans called it Yule, and it was the celebration of the solstice. But in Roman times, this was Saturnalia, and it was a huge festival where the aristocrats served the servants. There was this inversion of culture, and it was a huge kind of hedonistic celebration. So here we have this connection to Saturnalia and Pan, who is the deity who celebrated and reveled in the sensual delights of the earth. He played an important role as a caretaker of the earth. He had this beautiful music that he played upon his pipes and sang of delight, like a bard almost, mirth and merriment. But his songs centered around the earth, and he lovingly expressed the earth's wonders. He was synonymous with fertility and love and all that was natural. It was the upending of malevolence and evil to Pan by the early church fathers that transformed his joyous, life-affirming revelry into an instrument of conformity and distrust of the natural self. This was due in part to their fears of a return to paganism, and their dictum was ultimately, it resulted in the aligning of sensual pleasure and belief in one's own innate connection to the divine through nature and body, with lies, deception, and most importantly, evil. So Pan himself became the devil, separate from God and the basis of sin. And this time of year does always, and anything that's associated with the dark does bring us into that question, where we've lived in this paradigm that has so demonized anything that has to do with the dark. We've become afraid and uncomfortable in the dark realms, in the places where we don't have control, in the places where we are forced to slow down. Like I've had so many friends recently with viruses who've talked about hearing the voice of productivity in their head and how they feel like slothful or slovenly for taking the time that they need to heal. And that's a product of that kind of Judeo-Christian work ethic from, it's not even Judeo-Christian, it's probably more like Protestant work ethic that we in the West have. So the cleaving of good and evil into separate identities helps explain the genesis of the devil archetype, says Lee. When viewed for what this archetype actually symbolizes, one begins to appreciate the underlying emphasis of the devil, which is to cultivate an examination of any and all areas of existence and experience that have become rigid or fixed. The tarot devil symbolizes mastery over the objective world and form. And in order to have mastery, one must learn through experience the materials one is working with. And that's so Capricornian, that idea of, and even Saturnine, that idea of repetitive exposure to what we're working with to refine and build mastery. So the same is true in the development of human consciousness, Lee says. Nothing is bestowed that is not earned. Every lesson learned in life, whether for good or ill, is slowly teaching the individual of personal responsibility and choice. This is sort of where this idea of inventory comes in at the end of the year. Like when we hash out the details of the past year, look at what we want to keep and what we want to let go of, what we want to cultivate around mastery in the coming year. That idea of the setting New Year's resolutions. Like we don't call them intentions, we call them resolutions. And that has a very Capricornian energy. So it says, nothing is bestowed that is not earned. Every lesson learned in life, whether for good or ill, is slowly teaching the individual personal responsibility and choice. The decisions that one makes, the fears attendant with change, the willingness to consider the greater good are all necessary catalysts for developing an enlightened relationship within oneself and the world. It should be remembered that an evil or sinful nature is not the production of a devil. Rather, it's the manifestation of ignorance. The responsibility for evil in the world is of man's making and will persist as a reality so long as the laws of right thinking and right action are ignored. And I think that's so evident in what we're seeing play out right now on the world stage. One of the things that is sort of it's paradoxical, like we spoke about at the beginning, kind of in the feminine, everything is paradoxical. So on the one hand, one of the things that has really been like a pebble in my shoe driving me nuts is the fact that we so deeply need wisdom right now. Like we need somebody to break the particular cycle that we're in. There's been a rigidity in the cycle, meaning the cycle hasn't changed. There's been no outside impetus that has come in and broken it. So we're in these never-ending cycles of violence, and there's been no real wisdom brought to them. So they're being dealt with in ignorance. And what's been really interesting to watch is them put an intellectual veneer over their choice to bring ignorance to this issue. And then on the other hand, I see this, we talked about it when we did the tarot or the tower transmission about this energetic impetus that did come in with the upswell of violence, and how often that kind of like huge upswell of energy can be an attempt to break rigidity, right? And what happens then is that attempt to break rigidity is met in a way that re-solidifies the situation in its current iteration. And so it's like we have this upswell that has now become part of that rigid cycle. But that upswell is always trying to break what has crystallized. And then the response is always to push it back down and just keep it in this ongoing stasis that we've seen for decades. And unfortunately, it's kind of been like it's these upswells. They've had different strengths over the year, but this last one I feel was, and this is from an evolutionary and very meta perspective. I'm not talking political. I'm talking about like what's unconscious, why it was so horrific and magnified, I think was again an attempt to break through the rigidity. So the tarot, I'm going back to Lee's book here, the tarot devil is the teacher of right knowledge concerning the illusory nature of material reality. So he assumes the role of the tempter and the redeemer, insisting that all desire for transformation and change be tested. Only that which is built upon a firm foundation will endure, and all else will vanish. And you can sort of hear a almost karmic Libran theme here. Like where Libra is the scales of justice, and it really talks to us in the realm of man's laws and what man is doing. Here you hear like a deeper, and remember, Saturn is exalted in Libra, so there's a connection to Libra. There's this sense that there's a deeper, or on a different dimension of reality, a different kind of leveling happening here. So in terms of the tarot, it should be remembered, Lee says, that the devil archetype is the master of manifest form. His seeming reality is only an illusion which must be faced and conquered before one is able to penetrate further into the mysteries surrounding the nature of inner self or individuality. So in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, this is William Blake. This is a long, long poem that I really love, and I studied it years ago. It says, the ancient poets animated all sensible objects with gods or geniuses, calling them the names and adorning them with properties of woods, rivers, mountains, lakes, cities, nations, and whatever their enlarged and numerous senses could perceive. And particularly, they studied the genius of each city and country, placing it under its mental deity, till a system was formed which some took advantage of and enslaved the vulgar by attempting to realize or abstract the mental deities from their objects. Thus began the priesthood. And so what's really interesting is in what he's saying is that we can see that theme playing out when we turn our attention to that conflict where they've evoked that archetypal imagery of the good and the bad, the people of the dark and the people of the light, the children of the dark and the children of the light. And so it's like it's such an exaggerated theme that's rolling through the collective right now. And there's this way that by naming the vulgar, by naming the lowly, the wretched, the seemingly immoral, the priesthood was born, right? Attempting to realize or abstract the mental deities from their objects, the mental deities, Mercury, thus began the priesthood, choosing forms to worship from poetic tales. And at length they pronounced that the gods had ordered such things. Thus men forgot that all deities reside in the human breast. And I love that because we're in the heart chakra in Venus, and remembering that all of these dictates and all of the ways that the priests and talking heads on mainstream media, or the people who come out as false prophets or priests who tell us this is the way that we should view the world, are potentially asking us to place our faith in them versus remembering that all deities reside in the human breast and the human heart. So Blake, what he does is he reveals a profound insight regarding archetypal energies, that their anthropomorphism, which means when we personify them, is the invention of the human imagination, and as such, it mirrors back the projections and interpretations cast upon them. The devil archetype is a perfect example of this propensity, as the devil has no reality as a separate and actual entity. He is, in a sense, a very real shadow, projected by the individual and the collective will, imagination, and conviction. So beliefs which are deeply felt and adhered to will emerge subjectively true. The assertion, be careful what you wish for or what you fear, You might just make it so, aptly suggests an important insight connected to the devil archetype. Rather than dismiss the devil as fiction or a cautionary tale, let me read that sentence again. I don't know why. Sometimes the way he writes with such big words and I try not to sound like I'm reading because it's boring to listen to that. Rather than dismiss the devil as fiction, a cautionary note might suffice. So he's saying the devil's got some reality to it. And a cautionary note might suffice. We shouldn't dismiss him entirely. The devil is an ancient creation of the human mind, having been born of physical energy connected with firm conviction in its apparent reality. As such, it is a phantom, but a potent one. The lesson of this path is learning to what extent to believe in something makes it real and gives it life. So the human imagination is a limitless resource of creativity and passion, pain, anger, love, tenderness, and cruelty. And interestingly enough, right now, as we're having this solstice, in the solstice chart, I think Mercury is squaring, let's see. Sorry. What do I want to do? I want to see the solstice chart, what Mercury is doing with Neptune. Yeah, there's this Mercury squaring Neptune. And the square to Neptune can make us feel confused or make us believe in illusion or make illusion feel real. And so this feels very potent and pertinent right now as we have so many different swirling narratives. It is very easy to get outside of what we know to be true and what we know to believe. And so rooting back into that is really important. So he talks about the imagination being limitless. Its expression is seen in the greatest achievements of the human race, as well as within the destruction and violence of war, unresolved hatreds, and the rise of tyrants. So as such, the devil represents a remarkable crucible within which hopes, dreams, fears, and yearning, not simply within the individual, but within the race as a whole, find residence. And one of the important roles played by this archetype is as the instructor in the ways of the world and the magical properties of thought. The devil archetype teaches a fundamental understanding that repressed thoughts and energies mirror back and amplify their negative expression. And this is the experience of the underworld. I mean, this is what's going on. This is why we resist the underworld. It's why we don't want to go to the underworld. It's because we're faced with all of our fears, all of the projections, all of our repressed thoughts being amplified back to us, all of our shames, everything that we have stuffed in the metaphorical closet of our lives so as not to look at it, it gets amplified and mirrored to us in the underworld. And all thought and emotion generate their own psychic reality within the individual. If the individual does not recognize his own hand in the creation of mental phantoms, he can inadvertently engender forces that act autonomously and aggressively. These seemingly very real devils are due to an amplification of areas of the psyche that have congealed. What is created is, as noted as Jung writes, is an autonomous being capable of interfering with the intentions of the ego, possessing a mental life of its own. The illusory and psychological origin of demons produced subjectively becomes forces independent of the personal consciousness that engendered it. It is a magical creation, magic representing the objectification of that which takes its origin in the individual's inner life. And so I'm going to put this aside for a second and just talk about the the way that I just watched an interview about um polarity, like it was so polarized. And in an effort for each person in this interview to make their point, they had to demonize the other person. There was no bridge, there was no meeting in the middle. And the word stark positions or contrasts could come to mind. And they were in their own stark positions. And stark has to do with Capricorn and the fallowness of, deep winter. In astrology, Capricorn is the gate of death. We have the gate of, I'm going to try and do something with the chart while I'm talking. We have the gate of incarnation, which is Cancer, and then the gate of, what would you call that? Excarnation, Capricorn. And so Capricorn and this time of year is associated, of course, with death as well. And the threshold place and the charnel grounds. And as, like I said, my one astrology teacher called it the boneyard. And so coming and looking at this chart, which is really an amazing chart, we can see that there is this sextile between Saturn, who is in the real threshold, the real liminal space of Pisces, the real unity, that area that unifies, the liminal realm that we swim into this incarnation through and out of it from. So it's like these waters of unity. And one of the big themes that comes up in inside of Pisces is this longing for unification, right? Longing for the divine. We say that addiction crops up in Pisces because there's the soul has this deep longing to return home or to be one with. So sad. And so Pisces takes on this sort of area of escape. It's where Neptune it rules Neptune rules, sorry, Pisces in modern astrology, and Jupiter rules Pisces in traditional astrology. And so it's that area of escape where there's this place where imagination rules, where we can be creative, where we can go to the liminal, where we can take time out of life, escape. And then you've got Saturn there, and Saturn sort of brings the sense of like harshness to even these kind of escapism or creative places. And I sort of feel like part of what we're seeing going on the big screen and the intractability and the lack of really being able to tap into, it's also Pisces where this divinity lives, is because Saturn's so like heavy and dense and rigid and kind of limiting, that he is potentially limiting or blocking some of our access to some of these higher ideals. We see a lot of loss of human life right now, and almost sense that it's justifiable, and like a lack of empathy. And that feels just incongruent with some of the values that we have really seemed to espouse and engender as we have progressed. And so Saturn, interestingly, is the sign of conservation and tradition. And so we've kind of trotted out some of our traditional war rhetoric in like, oh, that's just what happens with war. But it had appeared that we were moving into a more compassionate kind of world recently. Now, on the other hand, Saturn sort of rules maturity and the isness of life. And that's another thing you hear coming from one of the sides. Like, this just is the way it is. This is the response you're getting. Kind of deal with it. And it's very naive to think compassionately in this moment or in this instance. So it kind of like runs both ways, Saturn being here. And so, but this is something that we need to contend with. Like, where do we fall um, along this dichotomy of the devil, good, bad, right, wrong, demonization, humanity versus the machine of like patriarchy and government, the way things are. Pisces, the other thing that it can do, just like Neptune, is occlude our ability to assess things clearly. And so if we've got Saturn, our assessor in Pisces, like, is he having trouble assessing the situation clearly? It does seem at this point, and this is a personal opinion, that the response is hazy. Like, there's no day after plan for this particular conflict. And I think because this conflict really is, it's sort of like upending the geopolitical balance in the world. The fact that there doesn't feel like a vision for the future for what's going to happen, can put our nervous system or our field in sort of a state of like, what is this about? Are there any real clear goals? We know you say it's about one thing, but it doesn't exactly look like it's about that thing. And where is this headed, right? And Neptune and Pisces can have that effect of making things very open-ended, almost like swampy, where there isn't a very real or clear objective. And so, with this being the solstice chart, I think, we're sort of going to be in these waters until at least the sun gets on the other side of Pisces or Saturn, um, or, to the equinox point. I think for the next 3 months, we're going to be really dealing with these themes. And then um, we've got this Mercury squaring Neptune, which again is great for imagination, bringing in creative solutions, but also can have us really invested in things that aren't true and have them really appear true. It can have things appear so true that like we believe them to on a spiritual level, like, and we get spiritually convicted by them, right? And then we find out that, oh, I was led to believe something that wasn't quite true. So again, the practice of coming back and rooting into what we do know. And to be honest, what we know is very few things. With Mercury in retrograde, one of my favorite things about Mercury in retrograde is that he becomes the cosmic trickster. And there's this divine comedy that sort of happens, and like we're reminded when our internet doesn't work and traffic jams and car accidents and things don't work the way that they're supposed to, that, oh yeah, we actually have very little control over what happens in our lives. There are very few things that we actually have power over or that are really, really, really true, and a lot of the rest of what we're doing in life is banking on faith, right? And we need faith. I'm not saying faith is a bad thing, but it is good to come home. And that's sort of the paradox of Saturn in Pisces, is that he brings a reality check to places where we've misplaced our faith. So the other nice thing about this chart is that we've got Jupiter making a conjunction to the moon. So the sun and moon are in this really beautiful supportive trine in earth signs. Earthiness is great. I think it's going to help us feel more grounded potentially than we have been feeling. I feel like the energy has felt very volatile for a while. And so we might finally begin to just sort of be able to push our feet into the ground a little bit and catch a steadier pose. Things may feel less chaotic, right? And we've got Jupiter then very close to the moon, and this is an uplifting signature. And so whether it is that paradoxes come in and the groundedness allows us to lift our eyes upwards, there is something that is really beautiful and uplifting about Jupiter making a trine to the sun, and then also to Mercury, elevating the mind a little bit, giving the mind some relief from the constant bombardment of bad news. All really wonderful to have Jupiter in the mix, making this trine to the sun. And then of course the ascendant is also in Virgo, and Virgos are seers, they're weavers of energy. And so it lets us sort of do our own weaving of all of the different paradoxes that we're seeing in the collective. And then pretty soon, it's not quite close enough in this chart yet, but we're going to have the North Node come into contact with Chiron. And that's really going to amplify that spot within us about how we are meeting our pain, our wounds, what healing looks like. I don't love the word healing because there is this kind of patriarchal or westernized mindset that's cropped up around healing that sort of feels like this Mars power over. I'm going to heal my wounds into submission, and then they're not going to bother me anymore. And that's what healing has become, wherein healing is generally sort of like a crisis and then a resolution and an integration. And so much of what I believe Chiron speaks to us about, him being the wounded healer, meaning, wounds that don't heal, he really speaks to us about how we meet ourselves inside of the pain. And I think we're going to, both on a personal level and a collective level, need to be looking at how we are meeting the wounds of the past, and this has been a big collective thought for me as we're seeing these very traumatized populations warring with each other, and genuine trauma, not like I fell off my bike, I'm traumatized, or she was so mean to me, I'm traumatized. Like, no, real, legitimate, deep, intergenerational, collective trauma runs through both of these populations in very similar ways. There's like a lot of symmetry between the two trauma signatures between these two people. And I really think that something miraculous and beautiful can happen if we actually, this is the North Node then in Aries, that sign of I am, I am that I am. If we can really work with some of that deep trauma that has us hate, and Aries is ruled by Mars, and there's this eruptive and can be very violent, primal, chthonic, to upward eruptive energy, right? If we can begin to heal this impulsive snap back decisions or needing to deal with or work things out through violence, perpetrate violence, move from our wounds, like that idea that if Aries is I am and someone has trauma, that it's like I am trauma. And that becomes true with traumatized people when when we're not really able to be conscious about our trauma. We kind of become the trauma and we make choices and live from that space. You know, what miraculous thing could happen if we really looked at addressing the issue in the Middle East from a trauma informed place? And I know that language is very codified and it sounds very lefty and hippie and wishy-washy, but I think, one of the things that happened is that as a recompense, and I actually think rightly, right? Like I believe in the idea of a Jewish homeland and the Jews having a place to be safe, right? So I think rightly Jews were given a country. I don't think it happened the right way. I'm not sure it was at the point, at that point, the right place to do it. It doesn't matter now because it's happened. There is a Jewish state, and Jews do deserve to have a homeland and they do deserve to have safety. But like that was our response to what traumatized people needed. And I just don't think it went far enough to address, and I don't think we knew enough back then. Pluto had just been discovered, and so we hadn't really developed depth psychology and really understood how things can live in the unconscious. And so I think it's just, for me, I think it would be really beautiful to begin to really address the collective trauma in that area and see what kind of ripple effect that could have for global thriving, global peace, etc. Um, yeah, and so I think I've been talking for quite a while. This is a really interesting chart. I think it's got a lot of really great components. We've still got Venus down here in Scorpio, not that far from Pallas Athena. And so one of the things we've been working on this month in Sky Dancer is, the places that like feminine hyper independence and that kind of idea that we're these women who are all powerful and can do it all. We could do it all on our own and we don't need any help. How that blocks the heart chakra. And so that's what we've been working on. And we've got Black Moon Lilith again, almost close to where she was at the beginning of the Venus cycle. So there's sort of an echo back to, checking in on our expression and how that's been evolving. We've got Mars and Sagittarius, and Mars is also squaring Neptune, and that's where we can get into those kind of like very charismatic archetypes that are false prophets. And so with both Mercury and Mars squaring Neptune, that just really kind of harkens us back to be careful what we invest our knowing in when it's outside of ourselves. So we'll check in again soon, but thanks for hanging out with me for a little bit. I appreciate it. Happy solstice.